Stinger by Tom Dell'Aringa. Read by Steve Ogden.
Chapter 1. Purgatory. Jimmy awoke abruptly with the horrifying falling sensation that most Hoosiers experienced on a daily basis. The scattered remnants of horror-inducing nightly terrors clawed at the edge of consciousness. He flailed around to get his bearings, then banged his head on the wall. But of course, he remembered. He was hiding out in a storage locker on the lower deck known as Purgatory of the Sol United warship Canopus. Also known as Deck G, Purgatory contained storage, quarters for support personnel, and most importantly, drinking establishments. Soldiers like Jimmy found them vital to maintain sanity in the galaxy-spanning war with the Andromedans. Jimmy groaned. His fears were already rising within, trying to creep into focus. Blurry vision obscured his surroundings in the dim light, and he squinted to make sense of it. He saw a tattered blanket, empty hoosh caps, and a larger shape huddled in a protective posture in the opposite corner. He had no idea who it was. He stood up and felt a sudden urge to vomit, another byproduct of his addiction. He grabbed for something to steady himself, but there was only the subdark of the locker, and he fell painfully to his knees. Muttering, he crawled toward the shape outlined in the weak light leaking from the door, which was slightly ajar. It was Andre, one of the cooks. Jimmy picked up the blanket some other locker denizen left behind and covered the man up, being careful not to wake him. The shape continued to slowly expand and contract in unconsciousness. Satisfied, he crawled toward the door. His hand closed on the hoosh cap he'd discarded last night. He shook it, but knew it would be empty. He was far too gone to be so reckless as to leave a remnant of the good stuff in a cap. He'd spent the last of his units on that hoosh cap instead of a meal. He knew he needed food. He habitually looked down at his hollow band on his wrist, but that had been sold 2 weeks ago. Oddly, disconnecting from the SatNet had ejected him from his last tenuous link to life on the warship. He now shambled among the ghouls and ghosts in Purgatory, hiding from those who continued to participate in their own lives. He slowly poked his head out of the locker. Not only was Jimmy a junkie, but he was also AWOL. When he was finally caught by the MPs, he would be prosecuted and likely deported to some backwater country on Earth, or worse, the penal colony in Ares Belt. But only if he lived that long. On his current trajectory, all bets were off. Jimmy snorted to himself. What would be worse, living in constant terror of his fears, to which no amount of counseling or drugs seemed to assuage, or life in a penal colony? He wasn't honestly sure. Finding the corridor deserted and quiet, he stepped out into the sterile overhead lighting and winced at the stab in his head. He stood for a moment on the steel plating, grabbing onto a pipe running the length of the wall to steady himself. He became aware of 2 new bodily pains of which the origins to him were unclear. He looked left toward the intersection that led to what he needed and felt a pang of shame. Meanwhile, silently in the cold vacuum, an Andromedan strike vessel glided toward the Canopus in stealth mode. Jimmy walked to the main junction surrounded by open blast doors. The left corridor led toward the pubs of Purgatory, the right to Angel's Place. He tried to make himself believe this was his only option, then berated himself for almost believing the lie. He'd been drafted 6 months ago, after the Andromedans took the war to Sol, using the tactic of inserting a horrific alien creature, dubbed Sasori by some Japanese officer, into Sol United warships. The creatures wreaked havoc, routinely killing everyone and suffering little to no harm from conventional weaponry. In many cases, they'd captured key personnel or contraband. It was a rushed boot camp as the Canopus headed toward Saturn. On the final day of training, new recruits were shown the footage. Surviving video from the wreck of the Vega showed the creature entering the ship and slaughtering the crew. The Sasori was a twisted alien mix of snake, scorpion, and crab. 4 small legs propelled it nimbly as it struck with savage claws. 2 hemispherical eyes sat atop its body, giving the creature 360-degree vision. But it was the tail that most unnerved him. Scaled like a viper and ending in a large stinger, it was able to penetrate the metal plating of ship decking. He was completely unprepared for the effect the video had on him. A primal fear awoke inside and gripped him. A dread certainty followed. The creature was going to find him and kill him. It wasn't the sort of irrational fear that he'd ever experienced. He tried to shake it off all day, but it wouldn't let go. That evening, the night terrors began, and then continued without abatement. After weeks of not being able to cope, he sought help. The first officer sent him to the ship's counselor, but he couldn't escape the unwarranted fear that the Sasori would find him. Those claws would hold him, the tail would rise, and he would be stung again and again and again. The counselor showed genuine concern. He was given medication to sleep, but it didn't stop the night terrors. And the further they got out into space, the worse it got. His squad mates were sick of his night screaming, and he took a few beatings. If it weren't for Isamu, his squad leader who stuck up for him, it would have been worse. He missed duty call and was disciplined. He felt shamed and alone. He saw contempt on the faces of the men and women that needed every able body. He felt weak, worthless. He became overwhelmed. He bathed in his fear, and it washed over him like a waterfall. Once immersed, he couldn't get dry. He found himself feeling utterly inadequate for any daily task. The simple techniques and platitudes given by his counselor seemed insufficient for the chaos raging in his mind. He needed something different, something to make him forget. The drug hoosh was available on the ship's shadow market. Promises of ecstasy and escape were whispered into his ears by those in the know. Just once, he thought, and for that day he'd have the strength to stand up and face his squad. And with that strength he'd carry on to the next day, and each day would build upon the previous until he became a functioning member of the ship. He owed that much to those who tried to help him, especially to Isamu. Just once, he laughed to himself. There had been no strength, only temporary forgetfulness. And there had been many, many more times than one. Jimmy walked down the metal-plated corridor toward Angel's place. He thought back to his stupid plan and frowned. That first day he'd hooshed, he spent half the day in unbelievable ecstasy, and the other half unconscious in a bathroom stall. That was all it took. In a week, he was into the hell of hoosh addiction. He'd gone back to his quarters to grab his belongings with no intention of returning. Since he was AWOL, he could no longer draw units, so he began selling his belongings. In isolation, he turned to petty theft to fund his addiction. He picked up the pace as he kept a wary eye out for MPs. Jimmy wasn't sure how Angel got his name because the dwarf was no angel, and not a cool, axe-wielding, friend of elves dwarf like Gimli in Lord of the Rings. Gimli was fun, and his actions were heroic. Angel was a cynic, and his actions were spiteful. Born on the moon, he suffered from achondroplasia, commonly known as dwarfism, hence the nickname, Angel the Dwarf. On the ship, he was Master Chief of the Mess. His people had access everywhere. He ran the best shadow market in the fleet. Jimmy reached Angel's place at the end of the corridor. He tried to think of some way he could avoid doing what he was planning to do, but nothing came to mind. He buzzed. After a moment, Angel's high, scratchy voice spoke into the hallway. "What do you want, man? You've got nothing left. Go away." "I've got one last thing," said Jimmy. A moment of silence. "You're signing your own death warrant, man." "You let me in?" The door clicked open. Jimmy walked into Angel's small but impeccably organized quarters. Rows and rows of sealed plastic drawers covered a whole wall, meticulously labeled. A small, clean kitchenette with a step stool lined another. A single chair and table faced a wall display showing mess hall schedules. Angel stood before him, only reaching up to Jimmy's stomach. The pudgy dwarf was dressed in handsome clothing of his own design. He sported wool trousers and an odd double-breasted red shirt of high-quality fabrics. His face and head were clean-shaven. Rosy cheeks creased in a sardonic grin. "I told you this is where you were heading. Bloody Hoosiers, man. Sitting around in a haze, hiding in lockers, and finding idiotic ways to die. Why don't you go get some help, idiot?" "Can we skip the life coaching and get on with it?" asked Jimmy. Angel shrugged. "None of my business if you want to kill yourself when there's units to be made. Let's see it." Jimmy wavered, realizing he was facing a point of no return. Angel raised an eyebrow. "Not so sure after all, are you, hoosh boy?" "Screw you," said Jimmy. He reached into his pocket and held up his civic ID. Angel snorted and took it. "Any holds or flags?" Jimmy shook his head. "We'll see," said Angel. He pulled a device out of a drawer and shoved in the ID. A civic ID was proof of citizenship in Saul and was used to obtain passage to the outer colonies. The card itself was an incredible piece of technology that was nearly impossible to fake or modify. Nearly. You couldn't make a civic ID card, but certain people knew how to alter one. Make a name and a number on a card change from, say, Jimmy Mallory, CV 3986-423, to, say, Jane Amberhold, CV 7734-223. Angel was one of those people. IDs could be traded for valuable goods, but without one you became an illegal resident. A nobody. Nobodies without civic IDs ended up in unlisted military operations or on penal colonies as slave labor. Sometimes worse. Selling your civic ID was one step beyond desperate. People who couldn't get one legally would pay almost anything. Angel was swiping through a display as data scrolled by. After a moment, he grunted and pulled it out. "Shockingly clean," he said. "Last chance." Jimmy said nothing. "What do you want?" Jimmy looked at the stim injector. "This is a stim injector," he said. "No shit, genius," replied Angel. "You a delivery system. Don't worry, it's loaded with a full dose of Compound 6. Jimmy stared at it blankly, knowing he'd crossed the Rubicon. "This will work?" "Man, for the space of 5 minutes or so, you're going to be the Incredible Hulk. Then you'll wish you'd never been born." Angel snickered. Jimmy pocketed the stim and looked at the dwarf. "You're going to get caught or killed, most likely," said Angel. "Probably both, in fact." "Try not to be too upset," said Jimmy. Angel laughed. "I've been warning you for months to get off the hoosh train, dipwad. I told you something like this was the inevitable result. Half the merch I move comes from desperate fools like you. Didn't I tell you to go to the medics and get right? I effing told you, man. More than once. You can still go. I guarantee I can find buyers for C6. Want your ID back?" Jimmy shrugged and shook his head, looking at the floor. He'd tried every legal medicine imaginable to cope with his fear. None of it helped. No use in talking about it with Angel. Angel spread his arms wide and looked to the sky. "But I'm the bad guy," the dwarf shook his head. "You're all the same, man. Get the hell out of here, dude." Jimmy raised his head to look at the dwarf and saw pity there. He turned and exited without another word. 5 minutes later, he stood across from a medical storeroom on the opposite side of Purgatory, holding the stim injector in one hand and a mask made out of cardboard and string in the other. Inside were the raw materials to make hoosh. It wasn't difficult to do. There were recipes all over the satnet, but the ingredients were expensive and under lock and key. But someone had access and supplied Angel regularly. He'd be moving in on that person's action, and they wouldn't be happy, but that seemed like a small problem now. He eyed the heavily fortified door. His plan was to make a batch and trade some to have it put into inhalers. Angel would be happy to arrange that. Then he'd have a supply for himself and a hefty amount to sell for units to live on. Was he really going to do this? Break into a medical storeroom and steal drugs? Be a drug dealer? It wasn't an honest question. His hands were already shaking, and his heart rate was elevated. It wasn't about want to. That's what Angel didn't understand. It didn't matter whose fault it was that the need was there. The need was there. You had to fill it. It was the gravitational pull of a black hole. Maybe he could sell enough to buy back his ID. Then he would go to the medic and get clean. Maybe go back to that counselor. But he needed this one last fix. Then he would have the courage to face this unholy fear that gripped his spine at the neck and refused to let go. Inside, a voice just laughed and laughed. Voices pulled him back to reality. Jimmy hid the mask behind his back as 3 soldiers turned the corner. Shit, most likely crew entering their alter-day shift. And they knew him. They wore canopus blue and gray fatigues. The first man was a tall Asian with bright hazel eyes, Isamu, his squad leader. The second was a shorter man with red hair and pale skin, and the last a dark-complected woman with black hair. Jeff and Gia, Isamu's buddies. Jimmy backed up and then stumbled against the corridor wall. "Jimmy," said Isamu, "holy shit, you dumbass. Do you have any idea how pissed Jenkins is at you?" The other soldier stopped. Jeff looked Jimmy up and down as Gia frowned. "The first officer's going to boil you," said Jeff. "Turn yourself in and get help, man." Replied Jimmy, shoving his mask into the back of his pants. "Look at him. He's in a state," said Gia. "She is right," said Isamu. "You look like shit. You been sleeping in the lockers?" "Yeah, he has," said Jeff. "Maybe we should collect a bounty." "Guys," started Jimmy. "Please, don't. We're not collecting bounty on a squad mate," said Isamu. "But Gia's right. You look awful." "I'm fine," said Jimmy, now more than a little scared. Isamu had been decent to him, made the squad back off about his night terrors, even made sure he'd got to his counselor appointments. Isamu frowned. "No, I don't think you are, bud. Look at you. You're in a flop sweat. What the feck are you doing here?" "Listen," Jimmy searched for a response that would satisfy them. "I got a little depressed about the night terrors, but I'm on my way to the dock to get a cannibal shot. Honest. Then I'm turning myself in to Jenkins, not looking forward to it." Cannibal was used to wean addicts off hoosh. It was known to have nasty side effects. "Doc ain't on purgatory, you schmecker," said Jeff. Gia shook her head. "He ain't going to the dock. You become a waste of space, dude. What's the point of you being here?" Jimmy shrugged. "Believe me, I've asked myself the same question." "We need all the grunts we can get against the droms and their pets," said Jeff. Jimmy swallowed, not wanting to think about the creatures. It raised the terrors from slumber. "I know. Sorry." "It's my ass if they find out I didn't take you in," said Isamu. "Promise me you get to the dock, then turn yourself in. I don't see you up there when I get back. You'll be in worse hell than you are now." Jimmy nodded, head still down and mask still hidden. Gia shrugged. "Let's go. I'm not wasting my rec time on some hoosh freak." She headed down the corridor. The other two followed. Isamu looked back and pointed at him. "Go, dude." Jimmy nodded, relieved, but feeling worse than ever about lying, as they disappeared around the corner. Damn, now he was really shaking. Isamu had seen him here. It would be easy to connect him to the robbery. But what could he do? His ID was gone. Even if he went to the doctor, he could hardly explain the loss of his card. And once Angel completed a transaction, he was done with you. No refunds. His other shaking hand exited his pocket to meet his downward gaze. The injector would be simple enough to use, and the rush he was going to get would be insane. He hoped it would at least settle his shakes. One last look at the storeroom. One last consideration. No way out. He put on the mask